Before we begin, if you enjoy stories where forgotten legends return not with noise but with purpose, where humanity doesn't ask for permission but leaves a permanent mark, make sure to subscribe to this channel. This channel is home to the best HFY sci-fi stories where Earth may go quiet, but it never disappears. Now let's begin. It started with a shadow, one that didn't match any ship the galaxy had ever recorded. No flag, no transmission, just movement, calculated, unstoppable. At first it was one vessel, then three, then an entire formation. By the time the core fleet scrambled, it was too late. Because these ships didn't match any modern architecture, they matched something else, something older, long buried, long dismissed, something from a species believed lost to time. And across a dozen star systems, 3 words began appearing on command terminals: Terran fleet approaching. But that couldn't be, because humans were just a myth. The galaxy has always had myths. Some are harmless, old stories told to children in low-gravity nurseries. Others are darker, passed between captains during long space runs, whispered in airlocks and under faulty lights. And then there's the myth of humans. To some they were builders, explorers, visionaries. To others, they were monsters, unpredictable, violent, clever in ways that made the stars uneasy. But either way, everyone agreed on one thing: they were gone. No one could say exactly when it happened, not with certainty. Records from that era are broken, scrubbed, or buried, under layer after layer of redaction. Whole archives ended mid-sentence, communication logs fade into static. Some said Earth was destroyed, others believed it was abandoned, and then there were the conspiracy scholars, the ones who claimed that Earth had never fallen but simply turned away, that humanity had seen too much, fought too long, and decided the galaxy wasn't worth the noise anymore. No one really believed them. It was easier not to. After all, no one had seen a human in more than 3 centuries. No ships, no colonies, no transmissions. The assembly marked Earth as culturally dormant. Its systems were locked behind navigation warnings and high-risk travel advisories. Not because of radiation or hostility, but because of emptiness. Scanners showed nothing. No satellites, no beacons, just a cold, quiet star and a once blue planet, now choked by atmosphere decay and dust. So, over time, Earth became an old reference. Curiosity in textbooks. A cautionary tale told to young cadets: don't burn too bright, or you'll end up like the humans. Even the few surviving Terran designs were seen as obsolete, over-engineered relics. Ships that relied too heavily on redundancy, with hulls built to outlast everything but memory. They were sturdy, yes. Impressive, sure, but impractical. Nobody built like the Terrans anymore. They didn't have to. The galaxy had moved on. Empires rose. Alliances formed. War came and went like the tide. Trade flourished, collapsed, then flourished again. Species once hunted to extinction returned through bioforging. The assembly evolved into something more cautious, more diplomatic. And yet, every few decades someone would find a signal, a reading, a scrap of data buried in a derelict probe drifting far past mapped space. Most were dismissed. Static, refraction, errors, digital ghosts. But a few described the impossible: a black silhouette moving against a dying star, a transmission in an unrecognizable Earth dialect, a ship design that matched nothing modern, but lined up perfectly with archived Terran schematics. Still, even those were swept aside, because the galaxy needed humans to be a myth. Myths don't show up. They don't come back. They don't knock on your front door with an armada. And so, when the first reports came in from the outer systems, when the outposts began going silent, when long-range scans picked up ships with no registry, no emissions, and no communications, the assembly laughed. Not because it was funny, but because it was easier than admitting what it might mean. But that laughter didn't last long, because the myth was no longer sleeping. It was moving, and it was headed straight for the heart of the galaxy. It started as a flicker, barely a whisper across the black. Series of low-frequency pulses picked up by a long-abandoned monitoring station on the edge of the Phelan Reach. The station wasn't even manned anymore. Its signals were archived and auto-logged into the Assembly's outer data net for monthly review. Most of what it picked up was space dust, meteor trails, and the occasional stray comms chatter from smugglers. But this signal was different. It didn't follow any language protocol. It wasn't even binary. It was movement. Repeating. Precise. Rhythmic. A pattern. A formation. It took 3 weeks before anyone noticed it, and when they did, they dismissed it as gravitational lensing or a solar flare cluster. But it kept going, and then it started shifting, moving across deep space in a perfectly linear trajectory. That's when the Assembly dispatched a probe. Nothing fancy, just a fast-response mid-range drone designed for data capture. It launched from a secondary platform and reached the anomaly zone in under 20 hours, and what it saw was impossible. There were ships, dozens of them, no heat, signatures, no engine trails. They weren't broadcasting identity tags, weren't requesting passage. They didn't respond to hails, but they were moving, faster than any known drive should allow, and yet showing no evidence of propulsion. They were large, black, silent, and old. Not in appearance, but in presence. The way they moved, the way they held formation, not like a fleet, but like a choir. No gaps, no drift, no signal. The drone tried to zoom in. The feed cut out instantly. No explosion, no EMP, just nothing. All telemetry froze. The drone returned, but its memory core was blank, not corrupted, erased. Whatever it had seen, whatever it had captured, was gone. But one data frame survived. One image. Partial, glitched, rendered in scrambled pixels and light smears. At the center of the image, a silhouette. Jagged. Wide. Too angular for modern design. And on its hull, barely visible through distortion, was a circular emblem. A white circle, not painted, but embedded in the hull plating. The record was flagged for review. Quietly. Within hours, the Assembly Intelligence Directorate had locked the file. Access restricted. All logs sealed, but the questions couldn't be locked away so easily. Because now multiple sectors were reporting strange encounters. Cargo routes rerouted due to sensor anomalies. Outposts requesting emergency evacuation without explanation. Ships arriving late, shaken, with crews unwilling to speak on record. Each time there was one common phrase in the incident notes. Unknown formation, no ID, too quiet. And when they plotted the locations, a pattern emerged. Not random, not scattered. A path. A wide arc, steadily curving inward. Toward assembly space. Toward the oldest colonies. Toward the political core of the known galaxy. Toward the systems that had once held the closest ties to Earth before humanity vanished. The Assembly tried to stay calm. They issued no alerts, no public announcements. They didn't dare use the word Terran. Not yet. But in the private chambers, behind closed doors, analysts were already connecting the dots. Historians were digging into forbidden archives. Engineers were cross-referencing ancient design specs that hadn't been accessed in lifetimes. And what they found made their blood run cold, because the shape of the ships, the angles, the layered armor, the silent systems, it all matched, not precisely, but close enough to eliminate coincidence. These weren't pirates. They weren't unknown aliens. They weren't rogue AI. They were something remembered by very few and only in warning. Someone said the word Terran out loud in the briefing room, and no one laughed, because now the signal wasn't faint anymore. It was growing. The myth was in motion and it wasn't coming to talk. By the time the fourth outer sector reported contact with the unknown fleet, denial was no longer an option. The pattern was too precise, the sightings too consistent, the fear too familiar. The Assembly Council convened an emergency meeting, quietly, off record. No media, no public oversight, and for the first time in over a century, the word Terran was officially entered into the record. The head of strategic analysis, an old, driven officer with 50 years in data warfare, stood before the gathered leaders and played a scan recording. It was brief, low quality, filtered through 6 layers of relay noise. But what it showed was undeniable. A vessel, wide, angular, armored in dark plating with no registry lights or emission trails, moving faster than anything that size had any right to. Its structure matched nothing from the known empires, alliances, or fringe states, but it wasn't unfamiliar, because buried in the Assembly's red-locked archive, accessed only once in the last 200 years, was a design blueprint, an old one. Human. The lines weren't exact. The materials were different, but the layout, the hull type, the flow of its structure, it was Terran, but not as they had been, as they had become. Someone asked the obvious question, how is this possible? Earth is dead. The answer came from a historian, one of the few specialists in pre-silence Terran culture. Earth didn't die. It disconnected. And now it was reconnecting. Not through diplomacy, not through ambassadors, through ships. Ships with armor layered like scales of a beast too old to sleep. Engines that left no signature. AI cores that didn't ping back. And weapon systems that didn't reveal themselves because they didn't need to. There was no broadcast, no claim, no voice demanding recognition, just movement. Purposeful. Inward. The fleet didn't stop. It didn't adjust course when hailed. It didn't acknowledge threats, and it wasn't following hyperspace lanes or gravitational corridors. It was cutting through dead sectors, uncharted voids where no one traveled anymore. Sectors once filled with Terran colonies, forgotten places, with names that had been erased from maps. Aegis Sphere, Horizon's Edge, Lunar Bastion. And every time the fleet passed through one, something strange happened. Satellites reactivated. Abandoned bunkers powered up. Old relay towers blinked to life, transmitting signals in lost human tongues. Not messages, not warnings, confirmations. The Terran fleet wasn't invading. It was checking in. And that terrified the Assembly more than any weapon, because it meant this wasn't a return out of desperation. It was part of a plan, a long one. Someone finally asked, what do they want? But no one answered, because it didn't feel like they wanted anything. It felt like they had already decided. One analyst tried to map the ship trajectories based on intent, predict where they'd go next. He plugged in known fleet movement data, system history, and cultural significance. The answer his system produced made him go pale. The fleet wasn't moving tactically. It wasn't encircling. It wasn't probing defenses. It was following a route. One Earth had charted long before the rest of the galaxy even knew what Earth was. Not a warpath, a pilgrimage, retracing every step humanity had once taken. Before, it disappeared. And that meant one thing. They weren't coming to conquer. They were coming to see what had become of the galaxy they left behind, and the question no one wanted to ask hung in the air like smoke. What happens if they don't? Like what they see, they had no intention of attacking, at least not at first. The Assembly, still unwilling to accept the weight of what was coming, decided to send a response fleet. It was called a diplomatic escort, but everyone knew what it really was. A wall, 300 ships, the most elite tactical formations drawn from 5 different species, equipped with the newest stealth armor, gravitic shields, and neural weapon links. They were told not to fire unless fired upon. But deep down, every captain aboard that fleet knew, if these were Terran ships, waiting to be fired upon might be too late. The fleet positioned itself along the orbital plane of the Cardan Belt, a neutral system just ahead of the Terran fleet's projected path. It was remote, quiet, ideal for a stand. And then the ships came. First 1, then 4, Then an entire wedge-shaped wave of black silhouettes slipped into local space. No fold signatures, no light distortion. They were just there. They didn't slow. They didn't scan. They moved with the calm certainty of something that had been here before and didn't expect to be questioned. The assembly fleet initiated hails in all known languages. They offered passage. They asked for communication. No response. Instead, the Terran formation shifted, not toward the assembly fleet, around it, not out of fear, not avoidance, indifference. The escort ships moved to intercept, attempting to form a blockade. That's when things began to unravel. Sensors failed. Targeting arrays showed false echoes, hundreds of ghost signatures appearing and disappearing across every screen. AI assistance protocols began returning corrupted advisories. Stand down. They are not your enemy. One captain, a veteran, of 56 skirmishes gave the order to fire, just a warning shot, harmless across the bow of the lead Terran vessel. The energy bolt never left the cannon. The ship's weapon system simply turned off. No explosion. No malfunction. Every armed ship in the assembly fleet experienced the same thing within seconds. Not jammed. Denied. Their systems hadn't failed. They'd been overruled. Every ship. Every weapon. Every drone. And then, as the Terran ships glided past, the assembly crews saw something they would never forget. Along the sides of each ship, faint and cold, was the same mark. Not glowing. Not pulsing. Just present. A white circle. Unbroken. Simple. Carved into the hull like a birthmark. Ancient, unspoken, and unmistakable. The Earth symbol. The fleet passed through the blockade without slowing, without reacting. And when it vanished, from sensors minutes later, the entire assembly response force sat powerless in its wake. It wasn't an attack. It was a message. You don't fire on gods. You don't ask for terms from ghosts. You move, or you're forgotten. In the days that followed, reports flooded in from the systems ahead of the Terran fleet's path. Warships shut down mid-orbit. Prison colonies powered off and went dark. Leaders known for brutality disappeared overnight. The Terrans didn't occupy. They didn't broadcast intentions. They didn't leave behind troops. Only silence. And with each system they passed through, the legend grew. The myth that humans were dead, that they had burned out like a dying sun. That myth was now ashes, because the galaxy had seen them, and they weren't what anyone remembered. They were calm. They were precise. They were inevitable, and worst of all, they didn't need to speak. They tried to rationalize it, tried to fit what they were seeing into a narrative that made sense. Rogue AI, a lost Earth colony, advanced pirates with stolen Terran tech. Anything but the truth. Because the truth was ancient. Uncomfortable. Too big to face without trembling. But the truth didn't care. It was already arriving. System by system, world by world, the Terran fleet passed without comment and without permission. They left nothing behind but operational failure and psychological ruin. No weapons fired, no bodies piled up, no threats issued, just correction, subtle, clean, complete. And in that trail of controlled silence, something even more terrifying began to rise. Memory. It started with the old ones, species who had been part of the galaxy when Earth still sat at the table. Scholars unearthed transcripts from the Age of Accord, handwritten in long-forgotten dialects, stored in vaults untouched for centuries. Notes about Terran negotiators who never bluffed. Terran fleets that always arrived late and still left first. Weapons no one else could reverse engineer. Ships that moved like thoughts rather than machines. But more than that, there were warnings. Lines that read more like prophecy than politics. Do not outgrow your conscience. Earth watches. When they are silent, they are listening. When they arrive, it's too late to explain. Terrans do not conquer, they correct. The assembly had buried these writings, too paranoid, too dramatic, too human. But now, those Same phrases were being whispered in command rooms, by admirals, by chancellors, by people who, only weeks ago, laughed at the idea that Earth still mattered. But that was the problem. Earth never tried to matter. It tried to warn. Centuries ago, during the final days of human diplomacy, Earth had withdrawn from the assembly. Not with bitterness, not with war, just disappointment. They'd said nothing in their final meeting. Simply turned off the lights and left behind a note, recorded in 27 languages. You know what you're becoming. When you forget, we'll remind you. And now the reminder had come. Across the galaxy, civilians began to act first. Pirates abandoned routes. Corporate mining colonies suddenly installed ethics review boards. Corrupt governors disappeared in the night, either from fear or by something else. No one knew. But the white circle began to appear, not just on Terran ships, but everywhere. Painted, on walls, scratched into steel, projected onto domes during silent protests, not as a call for help, not as a symbol of power, as a warning that Earth had returned, that it hadn't forgiven, that it hadn't forgotten, and that it was watching. Again, suddenly archives were reopened. Historians who had once specialized in Terran culture found themselves in demand and terrified. Because Earth had always been underestimated for one reason. They were human, messy, loud, passionate, too emotional, too unpredictable. But what the galaxy forgot was what humans did best. They adapted. They recorded, they planned, and when they chose to leave, they didn't retreat. They recalibrated. They didn't abandon the galaxy. They just decided not to warn it again. And now the stars were remembering why, long ago, when the most feared warlord in the Orion sector disappeared overnight, only one thing was found in orbit, a probe, still transmitting, on a Terran frequency, and on its side, etched with surgical precision, observed, judged, corrected, no fleet, no message, just finality. And now, that finality was on the move again. The Terran Armada wasn't reclaiming space. It was reminding the galaxy that it never belonged to anyone else. Among the dozens, perhaps hundreds of Terran vessels moving through the stars, one stood out. Not because of size, not because of speed, because of silence. It didn't lead the fleet. It didn't issue commands. It simply existed. At the center of every formation, always just slightly behind, slightly distant, like it was observing not just the enemy, but the Terran ships themselves. Its hull bore no name, no number, no lights. But every species that laid eyes on it gave it one. Judgment Class. No known registry had ever referenced such a designation. The term didn't exist in any human language still used, nor in any historical naval archive. But the name fit. The ship was enormous. Wider than assembly dreadnoughts, taller than planetary towers. Yet it cast no shadow. Its surface absorbed light in unnatural ways, like it wasn't made of matter at all, but memory. Every time someone tried to scan it, they failed. Not because it was shielded, because their own systems refused to process it. Reports described a sensation of weight, of pressure, as if the ship didn't merely pass through space but bent the rules that defined it. One fleet dared to challenge it. A confederation of hardened mercenary lords who had, for decades, profited off border worlds and subjugated minor colonies. They believed in numbers, in armor, in control. They met Judgment Class in the Herald Drift, 37 cruisers, 12 capital ships, one moon-based cannon array. The engagement lasted 6 seconds, and no one died, because by the time the first ship tried to lock weapons, it already couldn't, and by the time the second ship tried to retreat, it no longer existed. Not destroyed, erased, no fire, no wreckage, only empty space where intention had once been. The survivors, few as they were, reported the same vision. Not a weapon, not a signal, a presence. It looked at us, and then we weren't a problem anymore. That was the terror. Judgment Class didn't fire because it didn't need to. It didn't threaten because it didn't ask for anything. It acted like it was not enforcing a law but reminding you that one already existed. A natural law. A human law. A rule humanity had once whispered in early spaceflight, when their ships were still fragile and their reach was small. Just because you can, doesn't mean you should. And now, Judgment Class was humanity's final answer to everything that had broken that rule. Not with war, with presence. One assembly analyst suggested it was an AI core, developed during the early Exodus, a fully autonomous sentinel system. But, if it was, it had gone far beyond its original programming. Because it didn't just patrol, it chose. It passed by worlds without action, paused over others, and in rare cases intervened, always perfectly, always without error. Systems plagued by slavery, war profiteering, and corruption found their infrastructure dismantled overnight, not through violence, through undoing. Like the universe itself was being rewritten around them, and in the middle of it all, that silent black ship, Judgment Class. Not a vessel of war, a vessel of truth. It was never built to dominate the galaxy. It was built to remind it. Humanity never left. It just decided not to speak until it was time. The assembly tried to act. Finally realizing the Terran presence wasn't a rumor or isolated event, the core worlds gathered in panic. A summit was called. Emergency committees were formed. Security councils convened in secret. Messages were sent to the remaining fleet commanders. Talk of negotiations, of sanctions, of options. They used all the tools of empire, diplomacy, bureaucracy, controlled fear. But deep down, they already knew. It was too late, because the Terrans weren't reacting. They weren't maneuvering around politics. They were executing something that had started long ago. And the response? It had already happened. The galaxy just hadn't realized it yet. While the assembly debated, the Terran fleet split. Not in retreat, not in chaos, but with perfect coordination. Every major power in the galaxy received a visit, not to their capitals, to their history. Terran ships appeared in orbit around sites long forgotten. Old battlefields, war memorials, sealed laboratories. Prison moons left off modern maps, and in each place the same thing happened. One ship would descend silently. A scan pulse would follow. And then, silence. Not destruction, not damage, but systems failing. Communications gone. Power grids collapsed. Government archives wiped. It wasn't war. It was audit. Every time a Terran ship left a system, something was different. Crimes long hidden came to light. Names once erased from history returned. Files that had been deleted centuries ago suddenly reappeared in planetary networks, complete, undeniable, and damning. Entire governments fell without a single shot, and still, Earth said nothing. No ambassador appeared. No declaration was made. No demands were given. Just one message, sent once, and only once, through an encoded quantum relay, broadcast simultaneously to every known faction, every ruler, every databank. This is not a threat. This is a correction. You knew better. You chose otherwise. And that was it. No signature. But no one needed one. Because every system that had built its power on silence, exploitation, or forgotten atrocities now understood. Earth hadn't been waiting to return. Earth had been waiting for the right moment. And that moment wasn't about control, it was about clarity. No more excuses. No more hiding behind alliances or noble titles. No more pretending crimes weren't committed just because time had passed. The galaxy had moved on from Earth. But Earth had never moved on from what the galaxy had become. And now, it wasn't asking for a seat at the table. It was simply turning on the lights. The Terran fleet didn't stay. One by one, the ships vanished, slipping into fold space without a trace. No destination, no signal, just absence. The galaxy was left blinking, holding, its breath in a silence more profound than any explosion could have left behind. And in that silence, something changed. There were no ceremonies. No surrender documents. No declarations of peace or alliance. But the galaxy shifted. Worlds that had once thrived on subjugation began rewriting their constitutions. Empires that had silenced their histories quietly began to speak again. Old crimes were confessed, not under pressure but with shame. Memorials were rebuilt, forgotten names carved into stone. Entire star systems restructured their laws not out of fear, but out of something even rarer: understanding. They had seen what it looked like when a species returned not with vengeance, but with vision. Earth hadn't come to reclaim, it came to remind that justice doesn't die in the dark. It waits, it watches, and when the time is right, it moves. Across the galaxy, one mark was left behind. Not a flag, not a claim. Just a symbol, a white circle split by a single line. No explanation given, but no one needed one anymore, because now, every academy teaches about the silence. Every military program studies the design of ships that don't obey modern physics. And every leader, no matter how far from the core or how isolated their domain, has those 5 words carved quietly above their command chairs. Humans were never a myth. You were simply allowed to forget. And no one forgets now, because in every shadowed system, in every forgotten orbit, there's still a chance that the Terran fleet is waiting, watching, measuring, not to conquer, not to punish, to ensure that the galaxy never again becomes something Earth must correct. This is no longer the age of expansion. It's not the age of empire. It is the new age of memory, and Earth doesn't speak often, but when it does, everyone listens.